facilitate a discussion about field studies in some way. And one of our first questions was, well, are you looking for people to do field work, or are you looking for them to replace that field work? Because there are two different options there, right? And that was sort of a question, I guess, that had not yet occurred to them at the time. And so they're like, sure, you could do both of those things. And so Tammy and I talked about it a little bit, and it seemed like that was sort of an important question for us to be considering, especially kind of now that things are hybrid, things are weird, things are, you know, different. But also that our students are in different situations, and that this might depend a lot on sort of what kind of class or what kind of experience are you facilitating. Is it a field school? Obviously, it's very different than like we're trying to do some small field component of a course. But we both had very different experiences with that also from the past couple of months. And so we were going to kind of cover both of those topics and hopefully get some insight from you guys too about what you think is most appropriate and how to make those decisions, because I think that's one of our jobs now that we're kind of running into this new modality. So how do we decide whether we can do what we might call field work or not? So Tammy was going to start us off by looking at that question of sort of how do we do field work and whether that's appropriate. And then I was going to give you guys some examples of what people are doing instead of that for when you make decisions about doing remote learning instead, right? So you'd feel like it's not appropriate. So we're going to split it up roughly in half. But also we're kind of doing this discussion based. So we'll hopefully have lots of opportunity for people to give their insights or ask questions or whatever. So Tammy, you ready? I'm going to hand it over to you.
Ready. Okay, so hi everyone, good morning. I teach courses in environmental studies and organismal biology at Cornell College. And like most of you, I have very little experience with hybrid teaching and online teaching, but I got a crash course in it after spring break of this past school year. Because we're on the block plan, I actually taught 2 full courses, so 2 full blocks after spring break when we decided to shift to online learning. And so I was going to kind of share some experiences I had doing the field components of those courses with the group. I also had some replacement stuff. Katie's going to cover more of that, but in the small groups, I can share some of the stuff I did with, you know, how to make a field trip work online and that kind of thing. So I am going to share my screen. And okay. And I hope everybody sees a slideshow here. Yeah. So again, mine are gonna, do you see that, Kitty? I see you.
Yes.
Okay, good. Perfect. Yep, so I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna give some examples from organismal bio. Of course, I taught in ecology, and it looks like I spelled environmental studies wrong or something clipped it off there. But also these would be applicable also to kind of biology focused environmental studies courses. So in block 8, so the second of the 2 blocks that I ended up teaching online in the spring, I taught a course with Becky Richmeyer, who's also on here. So she'll be able to share her experiences too in the breakout sessions. We taught ecology. The course goals for ecology are obviously investigate ecological principles, but especially to give students hands-on experiences doing field methods in ecological study. And we do that through laboratory activities and field trips, as well as group projects in which students kind of create their own question that they can chase down using field methods in ecology to answer. So the way my course looked in block 8, we had asynchronous lectures that I uploaded that the students attended on their own time, 45-minute lectures 5 times a week. And we had synchronous meetings every day for 1 hour. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, these were kind of class meetings where we discussed the lecture and the concepts that were being brought out in the lectures. And then Tuesday and Thursday, we had laboratory meetings and activities. We had readings, 3 to 4 articles per week, and we had assignments mostly focused on the lab activities and the lectures that we were presenting. And then finally, there was a group project, a project that lasted the full month of the course, in which students did field ecological study. So this isn't all that different from what I do when we actually meet in person, but we had to make some adjustments, obviously, because we weren't able to take field trips and stuff like that. And that's what I want to talk about here. So what I had to get rid of, field trips, anything in person that we would normally do, like labs in person. Let's see if I can get that to move. What I kept but modified are, we kept all the lab activities. We had to modify them to make them work because we couldn't do them in person, but we did keep all of those. And we also kept the group projects, which is a really huge part of this course. This course is usually taught to juniors and seniors, often students about ready to graduate and look for their own jobs in field-based biology. And so it's really important to give the students the hands-on learning. And we didn't want to get rid of, you know, that inquiry-based, ask a question and figure out how you're going to answer it and actually do the research to answer that question. But we obviously had to modify it because students couldn't get together in person to do that kind of research. So I'm not sure why that keeps happening to me. Here we go. So with respect to lab activities, we normally do a population estimation survey on our campus to estimate the population of squirrels. This involves things like density sampling, line transects. How do you create little samples out of a bigger area and then extrapolate to that larger area? So instead of having students walking around on campus doing that together, we asked students to go into their local park or backyard or wherever they felt safe, going to sample for squirrels. And it worked really well. I think the students actually really liked the opportunity to get outside. And they were able to take the kind of main concepts of densities and extrapolation to larger areas, and apply those to the areas in which they did the surveys. Another lab activity that we always do, that we were mostly able to do the same way, is looking at owl diet and kind of dietary differences between owls in different regions in the United States by looking at owl pellets. We were able to do that more or less the same way, but we had to mail pellets out to the students. So this is kind of field-based in that they got to do the hands-on thing, but it was also virtual in that Becky was meeting with the students online and showing them little bones up to their cameras in a virtual way. Students used breakout groups to discuss the little things they were finding in their pellets, and they did most of the work while they were online together. Another thing we did was, normally we would take a field trip to a bird blind at the McBride Raptor Center, not too far from our campus, and use that bird blind to study bird communities. So looking at different feeder types and what type of food were in those feeders and the shape of the feeders, and starting to understand things about foraging niches among the bird community, and looking at kind of niche overlap and specialists and generalists within the bird community feeding on those feeders at the Raptor Center. To replicate that, this was more of a, you know, kind of an alternative to having the hands-on. Students, Becky found YouTube videos of birds feeding on different feeders, and students were actually able to identify bird species and do the laboratory activity that we would normally do in person at the bird blind using these YouTube videos. It's not perfect. Obviously, people post their videos of their most crazy bird feeder experiences. So there were a lot of birds on a lot of feeders. And I think in some cases, students had to pause and slowly ID all the species before they were moving in and out. But it was still an opportunity for students to do something. And I think, as we all know, being kind of stuck at home is kind of boring. And so any opportunity students had to collect their own data and actually do something was really well received by our students. There we go again. And then our final laboratory activity, we were able to do the same way. This is understanding prairie vegetation communities by sampling areas of grasses within a prairie and identifying those to species and looking at things like species richness curves. We were able to do that the same way, but we mailed out these samples to students so they could do the activities together online in breakout sessions, but by drawing species out of little paper bags and identifying them that way. So those were the laboratory activities. I think I'm going to get that beep again, so I'm going to click on this. What we also kept but modified was the group project. So we didn't want to do away with the group project entirely, because this was the one chance students had to work in a group, kind of following the entire scientific method, from forming a question to coming up with hypotheses, to testing those hypotheses and gathering their own data, to interpreting those data and making kind of inferences of what the research they did meant. So we wanted to keep that, but what we were struggling with was how to have students have projects in which they were working on in groups and yet be spatially separated. And what we did was really just turn this over to the students. We told them the goals of the group activity was to, come up with a research question. They understood the challenges of being located in different states, stuck at home, and all those other challenges that kind of come with this COVID-19 situation we're in. But they came up with really cool projects in which they were investigating ecological principles and using ecological measures, but doing this across the various living situations they were in. So they chose to look at things in local parks or backyards, across ecosystems, and in many cases across different regions in the United States. And I'll give you some examples of the things they did. So some of the topics that these groups covered were things like bird community diversity on various campuses. This was a group of students that each had access to a college or university campus not too far from where they lived. And so they went out and looked at species diversity of birds on the different campuses and compared those and talked about why the communities of birds present on those campuses might be different across 3 different states. Invertebrate diversity in 3 vegetation types. This also occurred across 3 different states. They were looking at forests, prairies, and kind of backyards. Robin habitat in Colorado, Illinois, and Iowa, and how tree density was related to robin population sizes. Stream ecology in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Washington state. Squirrel densities in forests of Iowa, Nevada, and Illinois. So the students came up with some pretty cool topics and were able to do something that we can't do when we're all on campus. They were able to look at how kind of ecosystem differences across regions in the United States were playing a role in some of the metrics that they were using. And they also presented their work in kind of a cool way. So they were presenting their work on using recorded Zoom sessions in which you could see the speaker or the student talking about their part of the research activity that they were part of. And I think students really responded well to this. This was an asynchronous thing we did because we realized that the presentations were going to take so many hours. We didn't want to take up our valuable synchronous time with that. But in this way, there was still that kind of interaction where you could see the student presenting about the work they did, and the forums that we set up for kind of question and answer for each of these presentations were pretty populated with a lot of questions after each of these were posted. So I could tell that, there was a really nice response within the class to watching their other students' projects and seeing what they did. So that was all the ecology course that we taught in Block 8. The other case study I wanted to talk about briefly is summer research. So every summer since I started at Cornell, I've been part of the Cornell Summer Research Institute, in which I bring students in as interns to work on research that I do in the Mount Vernon area, which is where Cornell College is based. We study monarch butterflies and milkweeds and look at how the relationship between prairie size, number of milkweed plants, and number of monarch butterflies that are produced by those milkweeds to try and help the conservation management of monarch butterflies, which, as you guys may or may not be aware of, the monarch butterfly population is declining pretty precipitously. There's a lot of research focus and management focus on bringing these populations back. So the goals of the research are basically understand the relationship between prairies, milkweeds, and monarchs, and also just to give students some experience with field population ecology research and get them something to put on their resume and talk about in those future kind of employment endeavors. So normally, my summer field teams look like this. They're all really close together, measuring milkweeds together, counting leaves, and looking for signs of monarch life, either eggs or larvae, underneath these leaves of these common milkweed. This year, it looks a little more like this. Instead of having teams of multiple students working together, I have two students, one located in Iowa and one located in Wisconsin, both located at home, but studying milkweeds and monarchs in the prairies near where they live. So monarch team for summer 2020 is two students, one in Iowa and one in Wisconsin. They're each looking at 4 to 5 prairies near their homes. They're putting in about 20 to 30 hours of field work per week, like they're actually getting out there and doing this. And I meet with them, obviously, whenever they want, when they're out in the field. And then also as a small team, we meet using Zoom 1 to 2 times per week just to discuss the results, like any kind of problems we're having finding larvae right now. Turns out Wisconsin's a little behind Iowa, so the Iowa student got a ton of butterflies and Wisconsin was all worried about that. But it sounds like Wisconsin's getting their butterflies now too. In any case, this is an opportunity for students to go out and actually collect data. They know the field questions. They're more or less on their own. I went out with one student, this is the two of us in the photo, just to kind of show her what kinds of things we were looking for. But for the most part, these students are on their own. When they run into questions when they're in the field, like, is this an egg or is this not an egg? They usually call me, usually using FaceTime or Zoom, and then they'll hold their cell phone camera right up to the egg and we'll decide together whether it counts as an egg or not, or what stage the larva, the caterpillar is that they're seeing. So there is still a lot of interaction, they're still in the field, but it's very safe in terms of how much, potential COVID exposure they could actually get through this. Like I said, the students are responsible for the research. I'm there as a mentor, but they're not always alone in the fields. One of them brings her boyfriend with her often. The other one brings her sister or her mom with her often. And then in the Iowa site, we have started a collaboration with the local conservation, the county conservation office, which means that we have been able to kind of extend that research to more of a civic engagement approach in which we're trying to support the efforts of the local conservation office in their monarch management activities. So the added benefits of bringing in these other people, our students are getting a chance to talk to lay people about their research and describe what they're doing. And then we also have this civic engagement opportunity that we don't normally have when everybody's in the Mount Vernon area. So what have I learned through all of this? I'm not sure where I am on time. One, in pivoting to online, I found that most of the components that I usually have in my courses, I was able to somehow keep in the online format or the hybrid setting. Sometimes those required modifications. like mailing out the laboratory pieces or taking students in, having students find local field opportunities to do the things we would normally do on campus. Other times we had to transform by using YouTube videos or, kind of other ways of having students have those experiences. And in some cases, online provided new opportunities that I've never used before. Doing ecological research across various regions in the United States was a really interesting way for students to still study something that they might have studied as a group on campus, but compare across these regions where they grew up and know very well. And in some ways, this kind of created a place-based learning opportunity that normally would be restricted to just our Iowa setting. And in this case, students were learning more about areas where they thought they knew very well, but were now learning in a new way about the ecology of their backyards and parks. I did learn that students really need that synchronous interaction. Like there is a way to put everything as recordings online and have students do everything asynchronously, but I found that students really responded well to having a bit of synchronous interaction every day, whether it be just to see each other or to laugh about how weird it is to look for squirrels out of your back window. They really just needed that synchronous opportunity. Another thing I learned with this field-based stuff is students need flexibility. So in some cases, even though it was short activities I was asking students to do, I needed to give them more time than I would have needed to give them if they were on campus doing the squirrel surveys, for example. They have all sorts of things going on in their lives at home. And those, whether they're sharing a laptop or they need a ride to the park or whatever it is, they seem to need more time to accomplish what would take a lot less time if they were all on campus working together. I got a whole lot of amazing responses from students about how much they love the hands-on activities. Even the picking, little bones out of owl pellets. They were just super excited to have something that they were required to do, and that went beyond just reading and commenting on articles. And I think that, that speaks to where we all are probably. I think we're all pretty happy to have something to do and a reason to go outside every now and then. And then finally, this is the last kind of main point of what I learned, and this is something I think we should all talk a little bit more about as a group. Not all students can participate in outside activities all the time. And that's something I didn't think about. I thought everyone would be thrilled to go outside and I should make them do as many outside things as possible. But in reality, there are some issues that kept some students back. And it's something that I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up in this setting, since I'm promoting, getting students involved in going outside. I think we do need to consider things like safety and equity. And it's this last thing I think that Katie and I started talking about a bit and decided would be worthwhile creating a kind of discussion among all of us about what kind of experiences you guys have and any other sensitivities you can think about. So like I said, going into this, I thought everybody would be able to do a squirrel survey activity. But in reality, I had one student who was in a super high COVID-19 exposure area. She lived in Chicago, actually a suburban part of Chicago, but all of Chicago was just blowing up at the time. And so she just did not feel safe even going into a park during that time. I had another student who was based in the south side of Chicago, and her concern wasn't COVID-19, but rather she said that she never walks around outside of where she lives because of gang violence and shootings and stuff like that. So neither of these two students felt comfortable kind of going outside, and neither of them had access to any kind of area where squirrels were existing or where squirrels were. And so we put them on kind of pairs where they could work with another student who was in a different area. In terms of equity, I mean, we're all probably very aware of the fact that not all students have access to the same resources or live in the same kind of environments. I had a student who lived in inner city Las Vegas during my ecology course, who would have had to, his family didn't have a car. He would have had to take like 3 buses to get out to a park where he could do the squirrel survey. And that just wasn't fair to ask him to, take an hour and a half of buses to do a couple, 20 to 30 minutes worth of squirrel surveys. And so again, we paired him with other students. I had another student whose parents required her to work while she was living at home. I'm not sure what was going on there, but I know that she often had, her work schedule was set up such that she was working during times, during the afternoon, which is, the daylight hours when she would have been able to go and do those squirrel surveys. So those were the things I ran into. I never even, sadly, never even occurred to me that there would be all this stuff out there. But Katie and I were thinking that maybe it would be a nice time for the group to talk about any experiences you have. Are there other sensitivities that we need to have when thinking about students participating in field studies? Maybe related to COVID-19 and safety, maybe equity, or anything else you guys might have run into. So let's open this up to the group in case we can kind of create a brainstorm list of things, best practices for other faculty members to think about.
All right, so I was going to give you guys some examples, partially from my course experience in the spring. So at Knox, we basically had to do it all from all of a sudden online from the beginning. So we were told like during spring break that we're going online, so deal with that, right? Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. Okay. And I ended up doing, so my course in the spring was soils. And that course usually has like a week, 2.5 weeks roughly of field work built in to, not all at once, but we do little pieces at a time. And so there's a big project, we go to the field station, we do soils work, but they are doing lab work all along. And so I had to figure out a way to kind of replace some of those experiences, and I didn't replace them all certainly, but I replaced some of the kind of more basic lab work. And my plan was to make them do this on their own in their home, wherever they were. And so in order to kind of figure out what they had access to, I gave them a survey at the beginning of the course, which turned out to be really helpful because I realized how few of them, well, not how few, but like there were a couple of students who just didn't have access to most of the things I wanted to use, right? I was thinking about making them use phone apps for various things, and at least 2 of my students didn't have a smartphone. I was thinking about making them do like very small scale soils work in a garden or in a yard or something. But I had a couple of students who were in like inner city spaces and just didn't have access. And so I had to be a little bit creative. And so I have 2 students who let me share their work with you. And this is an assignment where they were introduced to the idea of soil texture. We worked with the soil texture characterization and like, how do we define this and what do we call the different kinds of soils based on whether it's sand, silt, and clay and all of that. And so we did that with lecture. And then they were given a video from, oh, I forget who I got it from, but basically it was a video that was accessible via YouTube, I believe. And so that, sorry, I'm losing my thing again. That was something they watched, and then I gave them literature that kind of covered the process. So they had basically a step-by-step of how to do it themselves. And so I asked them to go find soil, right, and do this process and show me. And so they had choices for how to show me. They could make video, they could do a series of photos, and some of them did that. But here are 2 of the students who I consider to be sort of on the different ends of the spectrum of capability here. So this is a student, Olive, who was basically on campus working in the Knox farm. So they had access to everything, right? All the soil they wanted. And so I'm not going to necessarily watch this, but just to show you kind of the access, the soil that this student had was really ideal, and they could do anything they wanted to do. And in contrast to that, I had a student who was sort of in the situation that's similar to the student that Tammy was talking about, inner city Chicago. She also had childcare responsibilities while she was at home. And this was all going down the same time when all of the demonstrations were happening, there was rioting happening. She did not feel safe leaving the house. And so I essentially said, go find something that behaves sort of like soil. So this student ended up finding, so this is her childcare responsibility, her cousin, used dough and used a bunch of different things in the kitchen to repeat the process. So the question here is sort of like, what are we trying to get the students to do with this? Is it really just about learning how to play with soil in your hand? Or what is the learning goal? What is the outcome that we're looking for with this activity? And so the student actually did the textural process, like how do you identify soil texture with a soil ribbon, but was using, I think she ended up using baking soda mixtures after this. She did a couple different things to try to replicate the texture of soil. And I don't know if you can see the grades, but they both got all the points, right? Because the point of this exercise was not necessarily to succeed at making a soil ribbon, but it was to try the process that they were supposed to be learning. And she demonstrated that she understood the process pretty well. And so I'm going to try going to my PowerPoint, which I made mostly just to guide myself through here organizationally, right? So thinking about fieldwork in regular classes, not just, okay, we have already signed up for a field experience, knowing that we're going to be in the field, knowing that that feels safe for us. If we're thinking about our classes for the fall, where we now have the opportunity to plan for this instead of being thrown into it, we need to think about the fact specifically that our field access expectations might not be realistic for students. And I think Tammy did a good job of covering some examples of that too. But that in general, we should think about having some other choice, right? So whether it's use bread dough to do a soil texture assignment, or can you look out your window, or some of the archaeology professors that I've been talking to have talked about, for example, often we do graveyard studies or look at gravestones. So maybe use findagrave.com for that if you can't go to a local graveyard, or your example of bird watching, right? So, or squirrel watching, not necessarily going somewhere, which I think isn't that difficult if we sort of think about it first for a little while. But the other thing is to focus not just on, okay, what can replace this, but what is specifically the learning outcome that I'm looking for as part of this activity. And so if it's a field project, right, so here's just maybe a simplistic list of things that we might be looking for students doing field research. Similarly, if we're doing a field trip, right, we have specific things that we want the students to get out of those experiences. And so designing the data collection, analyzing the data, communicating results, applying knowledge from the course into some new setting. These are all learning outcomes that don't actually necessitate field work, but they are often the learning outcomes that we're looking for field experiences. And so kind of tie or draw out what specifically we're trying to get out of these experiences, to what extent can we replicate that and make that happen online possibly. All right, and so in these examples, number 2 in each of them, collect field data, is obviously a field requiring piece, possibly, or can we do that somewhere else? And then observing features and drawing conclusions, again, it might be a very field specific thing, or we can think about ways of doing that somewhere else. And so I was gonna give you some examples, and these are just links since I was gonna put this up on the Slack channel later. Some examples that people are using, largely in geology, since I'm in environmental science and geology, but what other places can we find experiences that replicate this to the best of our ability? And so for those of you who are geologists, you might already know this, but NAGT, the National Association of Geoscience Teachers, has a really awesome, probably the best one I've found, although I haven't looked at every single field quite yet, but they have this really amazing website on designing remote field experiences that actually has a bunch of webinars. So if I scroll down here, they've done several webinars for people doing even online camps. So geologists really dove into this over the summer, and we're doing field camps online, essentially. But they also have a webinar farther down here, and there's online camps. Eventually, there are some on field trips, virtual field trips right down here. So this has been something people have been talking about, and I'm just gonna leave this as a link in my PowerPoint. So those of you who are interested in potentially doing mapping activities in particular, this is a place where there's a lot of resources on that. There's also a bunch of links. So CERC is a earth science teaching resource has a lot of stuff, and there's a bunch of things that you can just steal from other people, right? The modules that people have made, and a teaching collection that they've been facilitating that has a lot of really cool stuff in it. And so that's a place I recommend if you're a geologist. And a lot of this has actually been based on using GIS, which I'm not going to talk about that much because I feel like if you're not already immersed in GIS in your teaching, that's not a thing you want to jump into necessarily right now. But if you are using GIS, that's what people have been using as a place to go find data. So having students outline, for example, locations of landslides using aerial photographs and topography in GIS as a replacement for field activities, but they're facilitating all of those learning goals, right? Like they're getting their own data, they're interpreting their own data from field settings, even if it's in GIS. And so fulfilling all of those goals is possible in some of these settings. For the rest of us, some of the places where we might look for data access, I think are a little bit trickier. One of the places that people have been utilizing, and it's kind of easier for most of us to jump into if we're not familiar, is Google Earth has a lot of tools. They have a lot of field trips that you can run, but there's also this thing called Tour Builder. And so you can actually build a field trip or a field experience for students. And so I just have an example here of one that was created for, again, this is a geology class at James Madison. They were looking for students to go on a field trip and collect field data and then make a map. But they essentially just made that happen within the Google Earth environment so that students could visit virtually all the places where they might have gone in person. And then there is embedded all of this other information like topography and cross sections and other geologic information that you might want the students to make use of. And so it's Google Earth, right, lets you zoom in, you can look at panoramas, you can look at the rocks. They've provided additional photos in some cases, or provided you with things that you can measure, or talked about the kinds of rocks that are there. And so the students then use this information. I believe they're making a cross section in this assignment, but that's one example of a place where you might stick a bunch of stuff for students to go use instead of doing a field trip, right? Another place where, and now I'm gonna have to find it again. Oops. Another environment in which we can use remote data access is story maps. Again, this is a little bit easier for students or for faculty, I guess, who are familiar with the ArcGIS environment. But story maps, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, allows you to embed GIS maps into basically storytelling formats. And so here's one that's very image rich. So there are maps. This is, again, a geology field trip. A lot of images, a lot of pictures, some geology data that they're throwing in for the students to look at. But then they also are embedding interactive maps. So here's a map of Indiana that you can click on and it tells you what's going on. You can look around. And so there's an interactive component to it where you can actually have the students pull data. And I think down here, there's somewhere they're having them pull like population data to talk about how that's relevant possibly to some of the geology they're looking at. And so students can investigate that. And so there is an interactive piece to it. There's a part where the students are maybe pulling data off of the internet in a not specifically the same as a field environment, but you know, we want to get as close as we can, maybe. Another place that I found recently is this thing called the Journal of, what is it called? What? Visualized Experiments. So it's a possibly expensive. I've talked to Knox's librarians about getting access to this thing, and I think it costs significantly. So I don't know whether it would be feasible for most people, but there are some open access parts of it. And the idea here is that it's a peer-reviewed journal, but also that it is video-based. And so people who are submitting their work here are submitting video work. And
field samples at a local site.
yeah, so this is going to talk to us.
Cast a plankton
But
net
essentially,
and
it's
allow the
showing
cod
you
end
the
to
field
sink 1 to
methodology
2
that they've
meters
used.
below
And so
the
they talk
surface.
about sort of the why, they talk
Tow the
about
net
the
at a
lab
speed
methods,
of
and they show those,
approximately
but they
0.5 to
also
1 meters
show
per
the
second.
field methods in most cases. And so
Continue
here's an
towing back
example where
and forth
they're
for between
collecting,
2 and 5 minutes.
forget what, out of
Towing
the
time
water.
should be
So more
adjusted
biology
according to
based,
plankton
right? But
abundance
talking
on
about how do
site.
we do it, this might be a good place for you to show
After the tow,
students
carefully lift out
methodologies
the
if you
net
can't take them
and
into the field
slowly
to use
transfer the
methodology
contents of the
yourself.
cod end
They
to
also
a 5.
have an educational piece, and this requires the subscription. They do let you do a free subscription trial for like 12 hours or something ridiculously short if you want to check this out. So I can't show you all the pieces here, but essentially this is more geared towards students. So it's sort of the why. What is this concept? It's not quite as research-based, but they show you the principles of the process. They show you the preparation for the process. And so this is a case where you're trying to get earthworms out of soil. And so you mix up a pepper mixture and then put it in the soil, and they show you the soil, the earthworms coming out of the soil and being collected. And then you could potentially give the students data that would follow that process possibly, and then have them do something with it, right? If you're thinking about data collection, maybe a combination here of showing methodology. They don't necessarily take the data themselves, but they can tie those things together more directly because you're not just giving them a spreadsheet, right? They're seeing the process at the same time. From a field trip standpoint, I think we get maybe more options where we can just steal more from the internet. So this is some of the stuff we already saw. Oh, this is some people get crazy with virtual landscapes. So this is a thing created at the University of Leeds to do geologic mapping exercises. And it's basically a video game. You can kind of run around in here as if you were in this virtual environment. And then I think they have an assignment that's associated with it where there's a bunch of like geology outcrops that you're supposed to find and look at. And then you do a mapping project with that. So that is a lot more work than I'm probably going to put into virtual field trips, but it's possible. You can also just steal this if you wanted to, if you're into geology mapping, because they have the assignments online and they let you use it. So people get a little bit crazy with geology, specifically online. There's also some people who developed similar assignments in basically a real video game environment. And so those are also out there. You can steal them too. But I think making use of what other people have done is really something that we should think about doing whenever possible. And then one of the last things I wanted to show you is just that we know that a lot of the stuff's on YouTube. So if you're looking for field methodology, Googling that, there's a lot of YouTube videos of field researchers, especially in places things that I do, right? That people are just showing you, how does this happen? How do we take data from a well? How do we take data from a soil core? And so you can use those. Google Maps, or Google as a whole, has a bunch of things now, including this thing called Treks, where they are basically providing field trips to not a ton of places, but a couple of places, like the Grand Canyon. I ran into this because I was looking at archaeology field trips. So having students basically walk through some very famous archaeological sites and potentially take observations of those places. And so these use sort of a story map / Google Earth type environment, but you can click through and visit, quote unquote, right, some of these places. And you could potentially prompt the students to take data, maybe, or at least make observations of these things and talk about them. And so it's sort of a hybrid experience too. And so making use of those whenever possible makes our lives easier. But there's a lot out there, I guess. If you haven't looked, do that before you panic about having access to stuff, because there's so much that other people have developed already. Right, let me see if there's anything else. So those are some of the big things. I also recommend that if you have not looked into your own field and the professional societies that are part of that field, if you have, I don't know if everyone in science has like a teaching society like NAGT, but if you do, they probably have a resource list. Although I found that that's kind of variable. Like I looked at the ecology one and it was not super organized, I didn't think, or at least they had one, but it could work. Yeah, so it could, benefit from some more organization. So it depends on what field you're in as to how much you're going to have access to. But yeah, Google Earth, I think, is easier for most people than GIS, at least. But I was actually surprised by just how much work some people have done with these virtual environments, especially with things like geography and geology, which are very map-based. So it does make sense that that's more accessible. But yeah, so I don't know how much of that I'm going to do in my class in the fall, but there's a lot out there to make use of. And I was actually kind of excited by this Journal of Virtual Experiences, or the video stuff, because I really like some of their educational pieces. They made a lot of sense for using within an undergraduate course, and then possibly making them follow up on those with a data set that you provide.
I'm a geographer, and I'm a social scientist, and I have a field methods course which involves identifying different historical periods in urban landscapes. And so there's a lot of context, environment identification, and architectural identification in a course that I teach. And I'm really trying to wrap my head around how I do that if people aren't in the same place, or they don't have access to go to a variety of environments. And so there's an adaptation I have to do, but one method that I thought about using is I've purchased a GoPro cam, which has a really great microphone, as well as the ability for people to capture 360-degree images, so you can actually pan around. And so I have an assignment where we do a field method together and do an architectural identification. And a lot of it is me working with students to identify certain elements in a building, get the vocabulary, train their eye. It's hard to imagine doing that not in person. But I was thinking about using like a GoPro cam in order to simulate that opportunity that could actually work asynchronously, but even have us have stop points where we can go back and talk about certain images, and then they can pan around and see the images. It's sort of the next best option I could think of for some very customized content, because I can't imagine finding something that would work well in one of these already existing videos that I know, Katie, that you brought our attention to. So that's a suggestion, and it's entirely hypothetical because I haven't done it.
Yeah, these make me really excited about like, oh, what could you do? And then I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Realistically, there's no way, but it would be neat, right? Yeah. I've also found a lot of stuff from, depending on what you're looking for, like if you look at tourist boards, like I work in Jordan, and the Jordanian Tourism Board has put together some really cool, they weren't working today for whatever reason, because it's Jordan, but they have some really cool like panorama views. You can go see Petra, right? And like look at all the panorama images of that. There's also a lot of field trips that people have put together just looking at panorama imagery, or gigapan imagery sometimes for geology, which is just really high, like megapixel. So you can zoom in really far, and just looking at those images and kind of panning around them. And so I think just doing a Google search with some targeted text or targeted terminology might get you a lot of choices depending on what you're looking for specifically. So one of the things that I struggle with a little bit as I'm trying to develop my fall course is this idea of these learning outcomes and how, what are my learning outcomes? Because I don't necessarily always think about them, right? Like I've had class where I've done a field trip for 20, how long have I been teaching? 10 years. And I've done similar field trips for that long. And I've never actually assigned learning outcomes to the field trip. I've just seen sort of what students do with it and how beneficial it seems to be for their learning. And so that job of assigning the actual outcomes and putting that in words is something that I've been working on over the summer, just to get a sense of, okay, what are they getting out of this that I can replicate in some other way? How much of it has to be field-based? And so that's a thought process that has been happening more explicitly, I guess, for me in a way that I could just kind of happened before. So maybe this is good for our teaching anyway, because it makes us be explicit about stuff like that we're just kind of doing otherwise, or at least I am. Maybe all of you are better and don't do that.
So that was something we thought about a lot when we were trying to figure out the owl pellet thing, because that whole like practice of wrapping up all the owl pellets and sending them in little packages with the things that students needed, I was like, do we really need to send them the owl pellets? We can just give them the data, because part of what we wanted to do, the pellets were just a means to get the data to determine, you know, what a population of owls was eating in the Northwest versus the Southeast, to see if there was a difference between the two populations. So it's kind of a community ecology thing. And the owl pellets was just like the hands-on part. And then Becky and I talked about this a bit, and we realized that not only, you know, did students kind of need something to do, but if they collected the data themselves, they got to kind of think about error. You know, like what if they identified that bone wrong? You know, and we could have just handed them the data and had them kind of compare the two data sets from the two different regions, and they would have gotten kind of the ultimately what we were looking for in terms of the analysis, but they wouldn't have gotten that bit of, you know, like what does it really take to determine what a population of owls is eating. And that's why we kept that hands-on bit. But it's definitely worth thinking about. Like, we do these things and we know they work, but what parts are essential and what parts were just kind of something to do because we had the students that day in class, you know?
Yeah. I had a similar result. I think you were saying that a lot of the students really liked those hands-on components and the field components of your course. Even the small amount of soils stuff that I put into my course, the students, like, that was their favorite part, right? Of all the stuff we did, even though it was pretty minimal compared to what I would normally do, they were like, I really loved it, even though I used whatever, baking soda to do this assignment, or even though I used, you know, a lot of them had to use, because they didn't have Munsell books to do color, which is the like scientific color numbers and stuff. But I gave them links to free apps that would use that same methodology. And so a lot of them just use their computer or their phone. And so they still, I mean, they got that experience of trying to figure out which color it is and the difficulty of deciding between two of them, and how it's actually not as clear cut as you might think. Oh, of course it's going to match and that will be easy. And that's not. And so I think that was still valuable, even though it was kind of clunky and they had to like hold stuff up to a computer screen sometimes. But they definitely got that piece of the experience. So yeah, I think there's still value. It doesn't, I'm not trying to argue that we can replace all of our learning goals or that there is no value in doing any of this stuff in the field, but that it takes some more intentional thought, I guess, about what should be kept and what should not, especially considering student capabilities. And so I guess my takeaway from this past term is just to make sure that you survey students and get their input about what are they capable of, what access do they have, especially if you're going to use like some of these really high-end, like that University of Leeds virtual world thing takes a lot of computing power. So if you had a crappy laptop, you probably wouldn't be able to do it. So even that, if you're going to be making them do online stuff, they have to have a good computer and good internet access for that to work, or it won't work. So even that might not be a good solution depending on the student, right? So thinking about getting their input, getting a survey done of some kind to get a sense of what they can do and what they can't do is more important now, I feel like.
I mean, every class that I teach, I have at least one field trip a week, if not two. I have group projects based entirely on being in the field. And, you know, I just can't, as Jim, I think, mentioned, how are we going to get everybody in a van? I can't imagine doing that. There are plenty, I can do a lot of prairie-based stuff, and there are prairies all around our campus that we can get to, or students can get to. But then you get in a situation where you have students in their own cars, you know, and that, you know, brings up the disparity between those with cars and those without cars, or forces people to get in cars with other students. I don't know if like field trips now mean outside in the, you know, on campus. That might be all we're stuck with. But if you guys have any creative ideas, I'd be interested in what you find out.
Yeah, I think part of it does depend on what our situation is, whether we actually do have students on campus or not. And I know that, you know, we probably won't have everybody on campus, even if we do have students on campus. So there is still some equity concern. I know my wife was teaching an animal behavior course in the spring, and you know, she knew that there were a number of students still in Galesburg, even though we were completely remote in theory. So she wanted to do her bat lab on campus with the students who are around, but she did talk to the dean about it first, if it's equitable, and had to email all the students in the class saying, are you okay with this? That some students will do this and others won't. So it becomes a little bit of a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I normally have lots of field trips during my intro geology class. And most of them are trips that one would need vans to get everybody to. And so the way I'm thinking about it now is that some of that stuff we're probably gonna try to do sort of virtually through videos at the sites. Or GigaPan. So one of the things that a couple of the field trips that we do are field trips to road cuts of rocks, and people can study the rocks. And so GigaPan is actually a good way to do that. But I think a lot of it is stuff that we just will throw out the window and do other kinds of things that we can do on campus. And so I, have always had this notion that I really need to have a soils component, and I've never done it before. And I can, if we're on campus, I can take people outside of the building and there are soils there. And so I think a lot of it will be dictated by things that we can do right outside the building. And in terms of, the comments about how many people can you safely do outside, if we're on campus at Beloit, which is where I am, because our classrooms aren't designed for distancing, we're going to have staggered cohorts passing through the classroom at different times, and we'll just use those when we do field trips as well. So we'll just naturally be breaking down into smaller groups to do that kind of work.
Yeah, that seems feasible, especially if you're reminding them, to stay away from each other a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, the students that I've talked to in the last few weeks, they're concerned about social distancing as well. Like, I don't think that they're all gonna immediately clump together. I think that they're concerned about things enough to realize the importance of, especially in an academic setting.
Yeah. Jim, when you talk about GigaPan, is that something you're going to have to go take? Are there GigaPans of these places, or do you have to go do them?
So well, I guess I haven't gotten over the hurdle of thinking locally, and I could probably steal more easily if I open the world up a little bit, which is probably okay. I mean, my classes always had this focus on southern Wisconsin, and we sort of pieced together the geologic history of southern Wisconsin over the course of different field trips. And so if I'm trying to maintain that, then I'm going to be going out and doing some gigapanning. But again, I mean, it's always something I've had in the back of my mind that I need to do for these places. There's a lot of good that can come out of all of the work that we're doing, I think, right? So, in the past, if somebody has missed a field trip, then the ways in which they could make things up have always been really clunky. But if I have gigapans of all of those things, and really to have students have that available after their field trips also seems like a really useful thing. So, all of the things that we're going to do because of the pandemic are things we probably should be doing anyway, right?
True. Yeah, I'm finding that more and more to be true.
So one of the things I like about two of the field trips that we typically take is we interact with people in the field doing endangered species management. So these are trained biologists who do endangered species management in whatever kind of, whatever scale they're working. And it gives students an idea of what a biologist actually does once they get out of college. And I thought I had to give that up, but in my endangered species biology course, I realized that maybe I could kind of turn it on its head, turn the problem on its head, and have biologists Skype in and, give the students that kind of feel. They drop all the right terms and bring pull together everything that the students were learning in class, but in a kind of vocational context. And we were able to bring in colleagues of mine working locally where we would normally do the field trip, but also at the state level, national level, and international level. So I had, it was really cool. It was something that I never would have thought of if we didn't get forced into this situation. But we were able to kind of hear how managers were thinking about endangered species and endangered species management at these different scales, which was, something I'll do even when we're back on campus. It was kind of cool being forced to think that out.
Mm-hmm. So optimistic. I like it. The silver lining, etc.
Yeah, ending on a good note a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Tammy and I will put these, well, I don't know how useful the slides will be, but I have links of everything that I shared with you, so that, I don't know if you're interested, but I'll put those in the, I think the week 6 Slack for ACM is all just the same channel for all of the different sessions that happened, but hopefully that's okay. And then if people have really exciting ideas, they can put those there too, if things come to mind after this. But hopefully this was sort of useful. And thank you to everybody who participated for your ideas. Good luck.
Yeah.
Anything else, Tammy?
Nope. I'm going to be really curious, how we all kind of think about this in a few months after our first time doing stuff on campus, but hopefully we'll kind of circle back and share ideas.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Talk to Brian. Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.